Okay. Order. We're now sitting in public and the proceedings are being broadcast. We will now hear oral evidence from Abby Dryden, CEO of the Defence Medical Welfare Service. For this panel, we have until 2:20. And before I ask Abby to introduce herself, do I have any declarations of interest?
Apologies, Mr. Chairman, for not announcing this morning, but I am a trustee of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme.
Take it there are no others. No one else is indicating. Could you please introduce yourself for the record, please?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Abby Dryden. I'm the Chief Executive of Defence Medical Welfare Service.
Mr. Francois.
Thank you, Ms. Dryden, for joining us this afternoon. We've asked a similar question to a number of other witnesses who appeared before us this morning. Could you give us your overview from the DMWS perspective of the bill and what advantages you think it might provide for service personnel and their families, and if you think there are any weaknesses in the bill, perhaps where it could be improved when we debate it on Thursday? So it's a very open question.
Yeah. I had time to consider the library paper and look at the bill, and in terms of the position of my organisation, DMWS, in terms of our view, if there's anything that the Commissioner could add to the positive experience that individuals have of military service, then we're supportive of that. In terms of our view of existing service provision, we don't really maintain a position. I think we're quite neutral about our view in general. I think in terms of our main interest, it's really focused on welfare delivery for service personnel in secondary care settings. So if the Commissioner was able to support some of the issues that we identify and probably create a situation where armed forces personnel felt better supported, or there was an increased or enhanced support for them in those settings, then we would be supportive. But beyond that, I don't think we have a particular view one way or the other on the bill itself.
Thank you. Just following on from your answer there, where do you think armed forces personnel need to be better supported, and their families need to be better supported than they are at present?
We collect quite detailed evidence, and we have done since 2018, on the experience that the armed forces personnel have while they are in secondary care settings. So we normally monitor the kind of themes and trends that are identified by those people that we work closely with. We identify, say, 10 trends each year and look at how we as an organisation and the funders that support us can understand better how military personnel can be supported. In terms of the trends that we've identified, they're usually things around about receiving care that is understanding of the unique position that the armed forces personnel can find themselves in terms of the settings where they receive care, in terms of understanding that it's a highly mobile population. We often deal with people who have quite complex family arrangements, or children with special educational needs, for example, or military personnel themselves who are quite badly injured. And in those circumstances, I think it's an understanding that service life is a hugely positive experience for many people, but there are certain times when an enhanced service provision would really be beneficial, and it's round about times when admissions to hospital take place, or when there's an increased pressure on the family as a whole. So that, I think, in terms of understanding how armed forces personnel could be better supported, would be really useful. And also, I think what would be useful for armed forces personnel is an understanding that creating a positive narrative or mentioning some of the positives of service life are really important, as much as it's important to identify the negatives.
Thank you. And just, you mentioned special educational needs. There's historically been an issue that where a service family have worked sometimes for several years to get a statement for an SEN child, what we would now call an educational healthcare plan, but a statement in old money, it might take them 2 years to get that from their LEA. Say it was Wiltshire, if they were based at Tidworth as one example. But if they're then posted to Catterick, they then have to go back to square one, or did have to, in order to start that whole very painful journey again. And as we're all constituency MPs here, so we'll all know how difficult it can be. This is not a partisan point at all. Has there been any progress on that issue at all over the last couple of years? And if not, is that somewhere where we should maybe be raising that issue on Thursday?
Yeah, I think there has been progress made, but I think the awareness of the fact that you are dealing with a highly mobile population and who are restricted by some of those procedural requirements. And again, it's probably similar with some of the kind of things that we deal with round about care and treatment for certain medical conditions being at the top of lists and then falling down to the bottom again when families move location. So I would say yes, that generally progress I think has been made in a moderate fashion, but there's nothing that assists people a lot of the time with different, whether it's NHS trusts or local authorities talking to one another in a really meaningful way and identifying that progress has been made in one area and an achievement of a special educational needs status has been identified and that being ported over to another area. So there is progress to be made, but our organisation, the welfare officers that work predominantly with the serving personnel that we deal with, that's a big part of what they do. It's maintaining that momentum for the family and maintaining the progress throughout systems and processes, whether it's in an NHS setting or in an educational setting.
One of the fundamental principles of the Armed Forces Covenant is no disadvantage as a result of service.
Yes.
So if you're saying it's got a bit better, that's encouraging,
yes.
But I think you're also implying there's more work to be done.
Yes.
So we might want to just explore that a bit on Thursday under the general service welfare provision of the bill, if we could. So thank you, Mr. Evans.
Michelle Scroggle.
Do you have any concerns about the transition from the Ombudsman over to the new Commissioner?
I don't have any specific concerns about that. I think I'd have concerns generally about any change in process. I think you can identify the shortcomings of one process quite easily sometimes, but it can be quite difficult to create something in its place that functions effectively from the start. So I would just be concerned about the transition, but I wouldn't have any specific concerns.
So you don't think that there's anything that's needed to ensure that a successful handover will be completed there and comfortable?
I think there's probably numerous things that are needed to ensure success. I can't comment on those things directly because I don't have enough experience to comment reasonably, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
David Reid.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being with us today. I should imagine lots of the people, service personnel that you deal with, might be physically incapacitated or not of sound mind to be able to raise service complaints of their own accord. Would it be possible to explain what the current process that you have to raise those issues with the current Ombudsman and to explain if you see within the current bill that process changing with a new Commissioner?
Any process that we would have that would support raising complaints would usually occur and usually quite effectively occur through existing chain of command. So in the 12 years that I have worked for Defence Medical Welfare Service, I have not been involved in an issue where we've been required to go to the Ombudsman. So in that sense, you could say that the current system is working reasonably effectively. You could also equally say that that there are probably issues there that maybe require further identification or require maybe the system to be more easily accessible. But usually the kind of issues that we deal with are things that can be resolved by chain of command, and chain of command have got very much a vested interest and are keen to resolve the issues that are presented to us for their personnel.
So following on from that, are you trained to advise service personnel and families to create a claim or are you being completely advised by the chain of command?
We are trained to... Part of our contract with the Ministry of Defence states that we work closely with chain of command, but we are independent of chain of command. So we are not... I wouldn't say we're specialists in guiding a family through potentially making a complaint, but we are specialists in understanding the delicate and conflicting interests that might be at work in some of the situations that we deal with. And if we feel that there is a need to refer beyond the chain of command or outside of that, then we have a process for that. And that's something that, in terms of our internal management structure, that we scrutinise that on a monthly and 6 monthly basis.
And the process that you have now, do you think that will still be fit for purpose when the Commissioner comes in?
I think it will be a different process, and I think we would have to consider obviously revising that. But I don't think, in terms of our viewpoint and our purpose in very many of the issues that we deal with, that it would change significantly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Graham Down.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a quick question. You mentioned the highly mobile population and some of the issues you sometimes have. Do you see the role of the Commissioner as helping or playing a role in some of those issues, particularly with regards to Scotland? We've had a few issues in Scotland recently of forces personnel moving, that causing issues with healthcare and indeed with education. Do you think that's something where you can imagine the Commissioner playing a role?
I would hope so. I mean, I think the devolved nations and the differences in the way that processes and particularly in my experience, healthcare is accessed is a different arrangement. And I think in terms of being conversant and fully aware of how that works in Scotland and in Wales and in Northern Ireland, I think there's a call for a nuanced and different understanding that supports some of the issues that are presented when personnel are moving to different devolved nations or different areas of the United Kingdom. So absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Pardon. Helen Maguire.
I just want to understand how you view the kind of current overall welfare services offered by the military service, and and how you saw the Commissioner's role kind of working to improve in areas where you might feel that improvement might be required.
I can only speak from my organisation's experience of working with the pre-existing welfare structures. I think the vast majority of the time those structures work very well, and I think they work well because of the people who are involved who do care about personnel. And it's certainly in my experience. I've only ever encountered a positive approach from military processes, structures, and the kind of the chain of command side of things in terms of addressing the issues that we present to them. They're very much interested in the quality of lives that personnel enjoy. And in terms of how I would see the Commissioner supporting that, or how it would be different and where there might be gaps, I think there's always sort of room for improvement, and I think where it might be helpful is younger people who are joining the military who have a different expectation of what that structure should represent to them and how they should be able to access services and the proximity that that institution has to the quality of life and the quality of their family's life. So maybe the Commissioner focusing on the changing expectation of new recruits and young people might be a positive addition.
Minister.
Thank you. I suspect I'm about to be interrupted by a bell. However, thank you for joining us today. I understand that your organisation works not only with service personnel, veterans, but also families as well. And I think for one of the key parts of this legislation is including the ability of armed forces families to be able to access the Commissioner. Just to help us understand, could you give us a sense of how the needs that you feel families have differ from some of the provision that's provided for armed forces personnel at the moment, and how the Commissioner might have a different perspective depending on which cohort they're looking at?
Yeah, I think lots of services, and it's not a failing of those services, but are very much centred around the serving person. And I think families can sometimes feel peripheral to the proceedings, not always, but sometimes. And I think being quite explicit.
Order.
Sorry.
I'm required to suspend the meeting immediately, so the sitting is now suspended, and we shall resume in 15 minutes' time. Abby, do you have anything more you want to add to the answer you were giving to the Minister?
Just to say that in terms of families and the Commissioner, that putting families at the centre of everything that goes on is really key. And I think in terms of families of all kinds, the notion of family has changed significantly, I think. So it's about making sure that that's an inclusive understanding of what a family might constitute. And also for non-UK serving personnel, that's also really important as well. Thank you.
Pam Cox. What time
The interruption earlier. I was just going to refer back to an answer you gave to my colleague David Reid earlier when you suggested that you hadn't had to forward any issues to the Ombudsman as previously constituted. Have you ever forwarded issues to other agencies on behalf of serving personnel or their families? And what kind of agencies might they be? Thank you.
We do that on a very regular basis in terms of referrals to other charities, maybe the Army Families Federation, Naval Families Federation, that type of organisation. Also specialist organisations for health conditions or for things that are specific to that individual in terms of what we have assessed might be of benefit to them. We also refer to legal advice if we feel that that's something that they are asking us to provide them with. So that's a regular kind of thing that we undertake organisationally.
But in terms of other ombudsmen or other commissioners, that's not been part of traditionally part of your
usually, role? No, and not in my experience, no.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you very much for your evidence. Thank you for coming along this afternoon. So we now switch over. Do you want me to call them forward? Okay. So to the next panel. If you would like to come forwards, if you're in the room. Okay, so we move straight on. If you could just all introduce yourselves for the record, please. You have a declaration of interest you want to make.
We'll check if it is the right thing to do.
Just give it. It's best.
I have a close family member that works for one of the charities that are here today.
Okay, I'm sure that's covered you. So, for the record, could you please introduce yourselves?
So I'm Darren Dockery. I'm the Director of Grants and Welfare of the Army Benevolent Fund and representing the Army Benevolent Fund here today. I'm a former, I have to keep checking myself, I'm not a former Army officer, I'm still an Army officer, but I've just completed 38 years of regular service with the Army and was reminded just last Friday that I have a reserve liability for the next sort of few years, so I am still part of that organisation as well. But I've been with the Army Benevolent Fund since the 1st of November in this role.
Good afternoon. My name's Mandy Harding and I'm Head of Commission Grants at the Royal Navy Royal Marines Charity.
Good afternoon, everyone. Simon Harper. I'm Director Grant Services and Programmes for the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund. Have been so since March of 2023, effectively responsible for the charitable output of the Benevolent Fund. Prior to that, I served for 34 years in the Royal Air Force and 2 years before that in the Royal Navy.
Okay. Mr. Francois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Efford. Colonel Dockery, I think in fairness to you, we should put on the record that the military liability has a different meaning from the meaning that it has in general usage in the English language. Thank you for your service. Firstly, just a branding point. The Army Benevolent Fund, a while back you had a bit of a rebrand as the Soldiers' Charity, I think. Where are you on that?
So we have rebranded now. So the old terminology, the ABF, the Soldiers' Charity, was what we used for a number of years until last year. We have now rebranded again at a very low cost. It didn't cost us very much. We didn't go through any hugely expensive marketing routine to do it, but we are now the Army Benevolent Fund.
To the status quo ante, as it were.
That is correct. Yes.
All right, sir. Now, you mentioned your 39 years of service, so you'd be perfectly human to be thinking about pensions. There's very little reference to pensions within the bill, but you could argue that if you're looking at issues of general service welfare, what happens to a service person's pension is very important to them and their family. Do you think it's a weakness in the bill that it doesn't say much specifically about pensions, and would you like to see that specifically included on the face of the legislation?
It's not an area of my expertise. I think the provision of pensions and advice on pensions is, and this is from my personal experience of having just gone through it, is adequate with the support of great institutions like the Forces Pension Society as an additional advising actor in this. I'm not sure that it is something that would require specifically laying out in the bill. That's my own.
Okay, thank you. I think we all know that the Forces Pension Society they're the sort of OBR, if you like, of all military pensions issues. So, but as they're not here this afternoon, forgive the questions yourself. Can we switch to the Royal Air Force, please? Air Commodore Harper. You're probably too young to remember, but in the Cold War, sir, there was what they call the Tactical Evaluation Process, or TACEVAL, where it was a bit like a sort of military Ofsted, and a team could turn up at an airbase, say RF Bruggen in West Germany, say that World War III had just broken out, and then basically put the station through their paces for several days, and then they get a Ofsted score at the end of it. The Commissioner has it's not quite as severe as that, but the Commissioner has a sort of Ofsted-like capability under this bill to turn up unannounced. Certainly within the UK, it's more complicated if it's abroad. Do you think that power is valuable, as it were, in holding people to account and concentrating minds? And how often do you think the Commissioner should use it?
I am old enough to recall TACEVAL, sir, and have been part of those way back in the late 80s. So, I'm very kind. But I remember them actually as Ofsted-like. And also as a commanding officer, I remember Ofsted visiting my unit, which was a training unit as well. So if I may just phrase my answer in that respect, I actually found those inspections to the chain of command hugely beneficial. On two grounds. They provided that independent view of the operational output of a given unit and allowed me with confidence to ensure that I had the appropriate processes in place and policies in place to deliver my output. I guess the challenge would be, and I've not been close to the Air Force now for 18 months in a regular sense, is how that is defined either in the bill or indeed in the roles and responsibilities of the Commissioner. So what output are you looking for from a particular unit? What is it you're checking? But properly configured, it would be of value in my personal view. The Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund won't have a particular view, but in my personal view, it could be of value to commanding officers if it was properly configured. In terms of timescale, I have no specific view, but certainly I wouldn't want to see anything once every 18 months would be the absolute maximum for me based on my own personal experience in a training establishment.
Just having spoken to some of your colleagues down the years, knowing that the TACEVAL team could turn up almost at any moment, very much concentrated minds, it kept people sharp, is how one person put to me. So it's a slightly different situation here, but most people seem to think it's good to have those powers in the bill. So if we can move to the Royal Navy, apologies for leaving the senior service to last, Ms Harding. But just on the housing side, in my experience, that all three services tend to treat service housing slightly differently. And from memory, quite a lot of service personnel actually live off base and tend to commute, as it were, to their place of work. Quite a few of them actually buy a property rather than live in a quarter. So obviously housing will be one of the issues that the Commissioner looks at. Are you happy that the powers in the bill are sufficient for the Commissioner to investigate that, particularly this ability to produce thematic reports, and housing is an obvious issue for an early report? Do you have a particular view on that?
So my understanding from what I've read of the bill going through is that the Armed Forces Commissioner would have the power to investigate and to look at issues that are arising. In our line of work in our charity, we obviously come into contact with beneficiaries and we get reports in through the partners and the organisations we fund. And in direct work with people that we have been supporting, particularly around neurodiversity and SEND, housing does crop up. And I think that's the exciting part of having an Armed Forces Commissioner, somebody who can hear from different areas and gather that and connect the dots really to realise that this is happening in different places. There's an oversight role there. I think that's incredibly useful to us as grant funders, because we do our grant funding based on needs, and so if needs identified, that's where we can come in and support and bring that wraparound support to families.
You mentioned SEND, which I think we've already agreed there might be a discussion about on Thursday because it's so important. Could you just say a bit about the work that your charity has done on the SEND front?
That was sort of directed to me.
Yes, sorry. As you specifically mentioned it.
Yes, so we realise that for a lot of our families, they have plus issues. So we know that across the country there are issues with SEND. We know that getting assessments is very difficult. We know that transferring across local authorities is particularly tricky. And I think the issues were laid out in the Living in Our Shoes report by Professor Jan Walker, which was commissioned in 2019 quite well. And Professor Jan Walker laid out some recommendations, most of which, over 100 of which, I believe, were accepted by government at the time. And so we have built on that report. We have continued to investigate need. We have gone out to beneficiaries to find out what is going on for them, what do they need. And that's the power of using commissioning principles in our grant making, which is quite unique, I think, to do, because then we can commission, if you like, through grants to meet that need, having seen who's the best provider. So one of the big pieces of work that we're currently doing is around neurodiversity. It's a big area of work, and in fact I've already booked to speak to both my colleagues either side of me, because we would really like to make this a tri-service piece of work going forwards. I think that's what will be required to enable the changes that potentially we're seeing might need to happen.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much, Chair.
Amanda Martin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your time this afternoon. So all three of you would have seen during your working lives and in the roles that you've got now as well, and had extensive conversations with service personnel. And we're aware that there's an attrition rates from the service, but also sort of that low morale and dissatisfaction with the role and various things around that. And sort of key themes come out of that number of times when we look at different surveys that come out, whether it's accommodation, career prospects and family life. And one of the elements of the bill that is different to what happens now with the Ombudsman is in the provisioning clause 3, which provides service complaints to be made from people who aren't necessarily service personnel. Firstly, your thoughts on that. And secondly, one of the themes we've had coming through is the need for trust, transparency and impact from anything that this new role does. How could that enhance that or actually not? All three of you, so whichever order.
If I can take the first part of the question. I think I referred to the Living in Our Shoes report by Professor Jan Walker. That report was very significant because what it identified was when one person serves, the whole family serves. And so I think that's a welcomed addition to have access for families. My colleagues at the Naval Families Federation will be able to speak more effectively on this. It's not my area of expertise because I'm a grant maker, but I'm sure that they would have more to say on that.
I would add, if I can, I've just in a very similar vein. I agree completely. I mean, we have had a phrase in the Air Force: support the family, and in that way you retain the service person by supporting the family. So I would be supportive of the service family in respect to the question you asked about having that access. One of the things I think is important that we recognise as a charity is the offer to the serving person. That offer is effectively a psychological contract that covers many, many different aspects, whether it be pay, pensions, housing, accommodation, food, ability to get access to medical and dental care, and indeed the charities too play a role in that offer. So it affects the serving families in different points at different times. So it is very difficult actually to say there's a single or a few issues that are causing the level of reported dissatisfaction through Armed Forces Continuous Attitude Surveys and the like, and the FAMCAS. The RF Families Federation will provide more detail on certain families, but it is a multifaceted issue, and it's very difficult to pinpoint one particular place. What really I think is important to understand is that offer is multifaceted, is a psychological contract at its very heart, and it could take a number of things which just begin over time to wear away the goodwill of that family, which then leads to dissatisfaction, ultimately people leaving the services.
I don't think I could add much more to that, and I don't think comment in respect of access to the service complaints system from beyond the serving person. But what I can say about the sort of, I suppose, the wider family context is put it in the, I suppose, against what we provide as the Army Benevolent Fund. So we provide a lifetime of support to serving soldiers, former soldiers, and their immediate families, including the bereaved, when they're in need. And I think that's built up since the history of the Army Benevolent Fund being formed sort of 80 years ago, because even then I think we just understood the importance of the family unit, and the importance of supporting the continuum of service, not just of the service person, but of the whole family as they continue through that journey, joining, leaving, and then serving, whether it be as a reservist or as a regular reservist, as in my case, and as a veteran, and the family that serves alongside them, and in the case when that person, family or service person may be bereaved as well. So I think it's that total inclusivity.
Lincoln Joe.
Thank you, Chair. You will have seen the witness list for today, and you'll notice that the only people we don't get to consult are the military chain of command, because their views are, for constitutional reasons, vested in the Minister. And so if I could just address the Air Commodore and the Colonel and just ask you to rewind a bit to when you were serving in the military as part of the chain of command, both on operations on the front line, and I know you both served time in the training base. My question to you is, do you see the potential for the Armed Forces Commissioner Bill as drafted? Do you see the potential for it to erode the authority of the military chain of command?
I'm happy to take that. Thank you. So, yes, I suppose there is a potential. The chain of command still has a vital role. But what I could see the benefit of this is having gone through and made my point, I think, about the offer being multifaceted, the response to that for the serving person and their family is multifaceted as well. So the Armed Forces Commissioner can play a key role in that. There will be times, I suspect, where it will come into conflict, perhaps is the wrong term, with the chain of command. I still think the chain of command must be the overarching way in which military effect and operational output is still delivered. That's the success of how it is done. But I think appropriately placed, the Armed Forces Commissioner can support, can augment, and in cooperation with the chain of command, improve the lives of the serving person and the family. So there is a risk, of course there's a risk, but I think it can work.
I would agree with all that. I would say there is potential for it to undermine the chain of command, potential for it to work against the chain of command. I think this is much dependent on the selection of the right individual to do the role. I think it's much dependent on that role being developed in a framework for operating beyond what's laid out in the bill of how it goes about. This office goes about its business. I think it's about building trust and confidence with those it supports, both individuals who might be brought, who might bring things to the attention of the commissioner, and also the confidence of the wider organisation as well. So I think, to answer your question, there is potential, but I think everything that I've sort of read in the bill, that I've heard in some of the debates that I've read in Hansard, I think this is in people's minds. And I listened to some of the earlier speakers today comparing it to some of the out with the chain of command ways that we have with dealing with issues now, sort of predominantly by, and you'll well remember, dealing with the padre and medical officers as something outside the sort of chain of command. All those things don't sort of happen overnight. Those need to be built up as individual relationships in terms of trust within organisations. And I think this is something that is new, a step beyond what the Ombudsman provides. And I think it is something that will take time and careful implementation from a practical perspective for it to work. But I do see that there is huge benefit in having such an office there, both for the individual, for the organisation, and in support of the chain of command as well. So I think they can potentially all work together.
Thank you, Chair. It follows on nicely, actually, from that question. Let's direct my questions to yourself, sir, if I may. I was reading your CV in the paperwork, and I was quite struck by the sort of range of experience and the number of different locations that you've served in, and I sort of join colleagues in thanking you for that service. I was very pleased to read that report. I just wondered if you felt, given that experience that you've had, active service, but also now in your new role, whether the Commissioner would be seen as sufficiently strong and independent to encourage people to come forward based on your experience and sort of both sides of the aspect.
So I think in terms of the legislation is certainly strong enough to put them in that position. I think, again, it goes back to the type of individual who is selected for that role, the trust and the confidence they build with the community. Certainly I can only speak on behalf of the Army. But it will take a period of time to educate people of what this role is. So I think that's why it's absolutely kind of critical that this bill is fit for purpose, and more importantly that the policy and the framework that sits sort of beyond it in terms of the implementation is right as well, and that we're absolutely kind of clear where the boundaries and responsibilities lie for this office, but also how the gearing between that and other offices. And I suppose it goes back to one of the issues that have been raised in quite a few times in the debate, is the scope of this role, and looking predominantly at the community that is subject to service law, and how that relates with the wider military kind of community, going back to that continuum of service. And I think all that, how that interlocks with what is currently provided by the Minister for People and Veterans, by Veterans Commissioners where they exist. I think that is all very important in the messaging and the communicating that back to that community, because it is a wide remit. I know it's sort of summed up in a few small sentences, but dealing with kind of welfare issues can be an incredibly complex, wide-ranging sort of business. And there's very few welfare issues that don't straddle the serving family and into the veteran space in a sort of time continuum. So I think those are all important parts of the messaging of what this role is going to be about.
Thank you for that, Chairman.
Helen Maguire.
I've got a few questions. So to start with, Colonel Doherty, obviously throughout your career, I see you've travelled throughout the world, been to Yemen, Kuwait and Afghanistan and various other places. And I wondered how you saw the Commissioner reaching military personnel serving overseas in other parts of the world.
So I think the legislation is kind of clear of where sort of access is permitted and enabled. I think it will be a challenge where matters of operational sort of security come into it. I think all those are manageable. Again, it's something that I think the framework of how this office will operate will need to be right in that sense, where that position can, where it is needed. My experience of operations is probably welfare is, I mean, again, this is going back more to my sort of previous experience than anything else, but I've always been close at my heart is welfare is a chain of command business. I mean, this is what officers, senior NCOs and junior NCOs get paid to do, and I'm always minded that I think they do that best often on operations. So I would hope that the Commissioner's role would be less needed on operations, but that's yet to be proved by kind of evidence or experience. But I would hope that we get on with that better there than perhaps we do in some of the more quieter peacetime locations.
Just a question for yourself. I wondered if there are any particular challenges that you see that the naval communities face in contrast to the other services.
It's difficult because I don't know the challenges my colleagues' communities face to know how distinct our challenges are. Somebody did describe to me that the Army tend to work within family groupings, units, whereas the Navy take a village to sea, which I thought was a very interesting analogy of how they described it, of the difference, and that brings different issues and lengths of deployments are different. I'm afraid that beyond that I'm not sure I can offer you more because I'm not cited on my colleagues' area of expertise.
Can I ask perhaps the Air Commodore Harkin the same question relating to the RAF, if you see anything particular linked to the RAF, any particular challenges that again aren't seen in the other services?
No, specifically, I think the 2 points I'd make with that is that there is a community and a family around a particular RAF station, of which there's 24, 26 in the UK, others elsewhere, but there are increasingly a diaspora of families who live elsewhere and separated from that base. So that maybe you have individuals who are weekend commuting into a different location where there's not the localised support for a family. So I think it does vary. Generally speaking, and historically, it's always been focused around the serving base for the Royal Air Force. But increasingly, we need to reach out into other areas of the UK where families now have settled for other reasons. And actually, that diaspora is UK-wide through the UK context. So it's a different challenge, and there's different needs associated with both.
Thank you. And thank you all for all the work that you and your organisations do. One of the bits about this bill, which is a development of where we are currently, is the ability for the Commissioner to undertake thematic investigations into issues affecting the welfare of our people and their families. Could you give us a flavour of the type of issues that are coming forward for effectively the cohort that we're talking about in the bill to your organisations, and how you think a spotlight being shone on some of those structural issues might be able to address some of the underlying causes? Because ideally, the purpose of this commissioner is to assist in removing some of the barriers and moving some of the obstacles and challenges that our service people and their families are facing. I'd be interested in get your sense as to whether they're structural, have always been here, or whether you are seeing changes in recent years that need to be addressed by the commissioner.
So I would start by saying that much of our work is currently done, our support is currently provided to the veteran and family community. Only about 12% of our grants go to the serving community. And that's because we base them on need. And thankfully many in the serving community don't feel that need until they've left. And that 12%, much of that is made up of family support in terms of bereavement and those sort of things. But I would say I think that is changing. I think in the future we are I think going to look much more towards causation, so preventative things which will be more so within the serving community. And I just highlight a project that we've just become recently involved with, funding a training and education mechanism which will look at domestic abuse. And that is not just treating or supporting the victims of domestic abuse through a helpline, that is part of it. But the main part of this, through a charity called Safe Lives, is looking at training and education, and much of that is towards our serving community through their own welfare officers. And I think this was an initiative that was prompted by work of our trustees, just identifying that they thought this might be an issue. We cross-checked this with the Army, and they believed it was. But I think this is an example where a thematic study carried out or report by the Commissioner could help identify other areas of need in the serving community where the third sector, in the Army's case, the Army Benevolent Fund, could intervene and try and get at some of these root causes of causations. And I think that's where we are intending to go in the future, while still providing the same degree of support meeting immediate need that we do now.
We're a commissioning charity in the sense that our grant making uses commissioning principles based on need, and we commission through grants to partners to deliver the outcomes. We do that by identifying needs. So we're very, very interested in needs and any identified needs, because where you can identify the need, that's when we can appropriate the right resources and the right investment. So from our point of view, anything that helps with that is very, very useful. And in terms of what's coming up, we've just commissioned some new work around mental health and wellbeing because of the changes we're seeing. So deployments now at our hostile areas, families have less information. It's harder for them. The anxiety is like, you can't shield children so easily from social media and the news. So whilst in the home, families have explained to us they've tried to shield their children the moment they go to school. And I think the HMS Diamond was probably a very good example of what happened there for those families and the distress that they felt seeing that on the news and trying to shield their children from what was going on. And so there is a change and a shift, I think. From our charity's position, we're currently looking at need again. We did a piece of need research in 2019 of our own. Professor Wolf's work came in, which is incredibly helpful. And with colleagues at Greenwich Hospital, Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust, I think all of us are now looking at need. We're working with the RAF, with the RAND research project to try and see what needs there. If a commissioner came in, it follows for us, we would be supportive of a commissioner who might be able to pull themes together for us and then we can make those appropriate investments. I think my only thought which I would offer from our experience of working with beneficiaries and organisations is managing, and particularly when I've done research into need and talking with beneficiaries, is to manage expectations. And I think managing families' expectations of this will be a challenge. Thank you.
Just a few points if I can to add. Firstly, from a Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund perspective, of course, we all meant what the service already provides. So much of what we see within the serving community in particular is what the Air Force has asked us to provide, or indeed that we have found a specific need, and which is not being provided either by the Royal Air Force locally on station or indeed by other partner charities. So I'd pick up two areas that particularly we've seen an increase or growth over the last couple of years. First is in emotional wellbeing support and a subclinical mental wellbeing, and we have a listening counselling service that now has about over 2,000 people a year access that service, of which 80% are from the serving community. It was originally set up as a veterans programme and now is dominated by the serving community. The second area is around children and young people, and increasingly we've picked up a requirement to support children and young people, not just in terms of after-school clubs, not just in terms of the youth provision that we provide, like a youth club provision we provide on stations, but actually holiday provision as well. So increasingly we're seeing the need to support serving children, and in that way, particularly where you have both parents who are serving, actually it's increasingly, so we've picked that up as an increasing requirement, and colleagues from the Royal Air Force Families Federation will be able to help with that. As far as addressing underlying causes and needs, I think if the Commissioner can be part of that solution, as I mentioned earlier, that would be fantastic. Already it's a multifaceted response, but I think if the Commissioner can then come and say, here's an issue, this is what we picked up, is it being picked up by any other organisations, including, by the way, local authority, NHS and local education authorities, then I think that would be of huge benefit.
David Reid.
Thank you, Chair. May I just echo the thanks for all you do for your single services. This bill proposes a lot of new powers for an Armed Forces Commissioner. If down the line when this Commissioner comes in, you take umbrage with how they're conducting themselves, is there a clear line of escalation in this current bill that you'd be able to provide a complaint to either the MOD or directly to ministers?
I don't know.
No, I'm because firmly in grants, I'm not the right person to answer that question, I'm afraid.
From what I've seen, it's not clear to me how that would happen.
Would that be beneficial for that to be in the bill?
Yes, it would.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, there are no further questions. No further questions? Then I'd like to thank the three of you for coming to give evidence this afternoon. Thank you very much. And we move on to our next session. We'll change it over. The only cups that should be in sight are the ones that are supplied by the House. Any other cups should be hidden. Sorry? Cups? Should not be here. It shouldn't. The only thing that should be consumed here is the water that's provided.
Okay. Would you like just to be behind?
Just anywhere where it's not.
Right.
Welcome. Ready to go? Yeah. Okay. Can I ask you to start by each of you introducing yourselves for the record?
Certainly, I'll start. Colette Musgrave, I'm the Chief Executive of the Army Families Federation.
Sarah Clues, Chief Executive of the Naval Families Federation.
And Maria Lyle, Director of the RAF Families Federation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Francois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Efford. Ladies, can I, having dealt with the three families federations when I was a minister, admittedly about a decade ago, I always found your input extremely valuable. So I'd just like to place that on the record this afternoon. I'm sure the minister will echo my remarks. As you represent the families of service personnel, and as at the heart of the bill are issues of general service welfare, could I give each of you an opportunity perhaps just to raise your top 2 or 3 issues under that heading that you would like to see the Commissioner produce early thematic reports on, and then give us some idea why you've picked those? So can we perhaps start with the senior service this time?
Thank you. Interesting term, welfare. We are not in the welfare space, so the Navy is looked after by the Royal Naval Families and Personnel Service, so they deal with welfare. However, under the term of welfare, what that might be to our families, certainly at the Naval Families Federation, our top 2 issues are housing and support to the non-UK serving personnel and their families in terms of visa and immigration, the processes and the ongoing need for support from our qualified caseworkers.
Perhaps the Army next?
I'm going to be very boring and, in fact, raise the same 2 issues, to be quite frank. Non-UK, but I'll expand a little on non-UK, if I may. We've had multiple investigations and reports into the state of housing, accommodation, SLA and SFA, but there has been very little investigation into the nature of the challenges and that our non-UK serving personnel and family members who may be non-UK also face in terms of service family life.
I think that's very fair. I mean, I know the Defence Select Committee have done quite a bit on service accommodation down the years, but I can't recall, having served on it for 7 years or so, us ever doing a specific. That was probably to the committee's discredit, but I can't remember us ever doing a report directly on that.
And those numbers, if I may,
yeah.
That's why I've been increasing year on year and form a much greater proportion of our armed forces than they once did.
Thank you. And the Royal Air Force, what would be be interesting to see if we've got a hat trick here. Perhaps you could give us your top 1 or 2, Mary.
Well, you've nearly got a hat trick. So you say we represent families, which we absolutely do. We represent serving personnel as well, which is why I'm going to say housing in terms of houses, but also single living accommodation. You know, we have 650 people who came to us this year on that before we get going on housing itself. My second one, we have a much smaller non-UK population in the RAF because we recruit differently, would be education and childcare. That's what people come to us about in its various forms and facets.
So I remember just anecdotally, if colleagues will forgive me, going to RAF Digby about a decade ago now, where you've got some very highly qualified communications specialists who do very important work, living in what were virtually demountables, for use of a colloquial term. And these people are massively employable in industry, and then we wonder why they leave. So I do sympathise with your raising it. Again, it's a bit of a hot button of mine, but you also mentioned educational needs. Does that include SEN? And if so, could you elaborate on that slightly?
It does. I mean, that's the very sharpest end of the wedge when it comes to challenge for military families. If they're moving, picking up that provision and replicating it in a new area is not always possible at all. So they are the most vulnerable, I would say, and the ones that have the biggest challenges to overcome in our systems. Right.
And perhaps I could take the liberty, Mr. Efford, of asking the other 2 services if there's anything you want to add on that SEN point particularly. I know because the Army tend to move around so much, it's a particular issue if you move from Garrison A to Garrison B. Is there anything you'd like to add on?
I would really echo Maria's comments. It is very much at the sharp end of things in the whole education provision for service children. SEN is a real concern for us, and we do have significant numbers of people who articulate to us that they are either going to leave or are going to serve in separated service because of the frustrations of many years of moving from location to location and having to start the SEN process over again. The transferability of that, the transferability of many things that affect service personnel and their families is in the UK, and both moving inside the UK and moving to and from the UK is a real challenge for many families and can often be the final tipping point for them in terms of making that decision to either leave or to serve unaccompanied.
I wrote a paper about retention.
Indeed you did, yes.
Stick or twist, and for a previous Prime Minister, and it's the pressure on family life, as we've already heard today, is the single biggest reason why people leave. But when we went round a number of military bases, we found it was often an amalgam of reasons. And sometimes you'd had a kind of pressure cooker effect over several years, and then there might just be one thing that, in colloquial English, was the straw that broke the camel's back. And sometimes it's just that cocktail that becomes just that bit too much. And is that a fair characterisation? I can see some heads nodding. So that still holds good 5 years on. Thank you very much. You've been generous with your time, Mr. Effer. Thank you.
Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start from the left and go Army first. Nice to meet you, Cliff, and thank you for coming. I just wanted to understand what challenges you see with families actually getting the support that they need, and how you think the Commissioner can kind of help address these in their role.
The challenges that we see with families getting the support they need can sort of be articulated as both internal and external. So internal, accessing the services and processes that defence are offering to families in order to maintain service family life, and those that are provided by one might characterise as external agencies, whether that's local authorities, whether that's the NHS, whether that's education provision, whatever that might be. And the nature of the challenge can be different depending upon who they are seeking to engage with. So the challenges within the internal system can be largely about not being able to access the right information, not being given the right information when asking for it, consistency of the information and guidance that is given, and then consistency of the provision. As we've spoken about, families, Army families in particular, are very mobile, and what they are provided with in one location might be very different to what they are provided with in another location, both in extent of provision and quality of provision. And for us, we would really like to see something for the Armed Forces Commissioner in this role, which we do, as the Armed Families Federation, we do absolutely welcome the introduction of an Armed Forces Commissioner with its, I believe Secretary of State said, their laser-like focus on the serving experience, which is something that does often get lost when talking about the Armed Forces community, those who are actually serving at the moment. Where the Armed Forces Commissioner, we believe, can play a key role is looking at that consistency of provision of both policy and processes within defence. As I say, many of the concerns that come to us are as a result of mixed information, mixed messages, not being able to access the provision that is there because they simply don't know how to access it or are being blocked in some way. Externally, the issue is subtly different. The issue externally is around, there is not an unwillingness from the UK general community, general population, to support service personnel and their families. What there is sometimes is a lack of knowledge and understanding. And many of the large organisations that they are interfacing with, whether that is, as I said, the NHS, whether it's a local authority, DWP, there is often a lack of understanding of the unique circumstances of service personnel and their families. And it is difficult sometimes for those families in particular who are, to an extent, slightly outside of the slightly outside to society. I'm not articulating it well because that's not what I want to say, particularly as a former service family and veteran myself. But they're often housing, sometimes healthcare, sometimes education, particularly if they're overseas or move back overseas. Their interfaces with external statutory authorities is not always straightforward. And can vary hugely as they move around the country, of course. Your experience in Scotland might be very different to your experience in England. And so their ability to interface effectively with those services can sometimes be compromised. And as I say, many of these organisations have signed up to the Armed Forces Covenant. The people at the top are very happy to sign up to the Armed Forces Covenant and say, yes, we've made a great commitment. The people on the front line who are actually dealing with our service personnel and their families are often not so well informed and do not necessarily fully understand some of the additional or different provision that's been made under the terms of the Armed Forces Covenant. So those are the big handfuls, those are the slightly different. And sorry, to finalise your question, that is where the Armed Forces Commissioner could help in those two key areas.
Thank you. Is there a very similar question to yourself? Because I know that you mentioned about enabling families to thrive in communities of their choice. So I'd really like to understand how you feel the Commissioner could work to support families to achieve this.
Thank you. Yes. Just being mindful that not all naval families live around the baseport areas. You would expect that some do, and that's absolutely fine, but others choose to live wherever their support network or their employment is. So actually, dispersed families are much more common than you perhaps think, because there is that assumption that everyone lives in SFA around a baseport area. They absolutely don't. So trying to reach those people who are very happy, thriving in their community of choice, that may not need any support from the Navy. But actually, when they do, if they have a life-changing event, or actually they don't know about the free swimming, the free sailing that's available to them, just spreading the net really wide and saying, if ever you need that support, we're here for you, in whatever guise that may be. Absolutely not. Welfare's not our part of ship, but actually giving them that little nugget of information just to take away a little bit of pain while they may be juggling a very successful career, childcare, while their partner or spouse is at sea, or worse still, under the water for 6 months with absolutely no contact or very limited contact at all. So I think the appreciation of service life, it's all very well to kind of think that we know what that means, but actually really understanding what that means across a huge range. Family dynamics are huge, and we really need to be mindful of who we're talking about when we talk about families, and let's not just pigeonhole folk and think we know. So therefore the Commissioner, do what we do on a daily basis and asking the question, what does that look like for naval families? VAT on school fees, what does that look like for naval families? Have you given them the information they need to make those informed choices, or actually they're going to have to half guess and hope that a hardship fund will become available so that they can get through Christmas? So it could be really impactful, and like Colette, absolutely interested to see how this could develop.
Same question for yourself. Obviously, you understand the difficulties and challenges that RAF families face, so just how the Commissioner can help support that.
Thank you. So I won't replay what my colleagues have said, and actually Colette articulated a lot of the challenges that RAF families would face as well in terms of their mobility. So we very much see that. I think the thing that sums it up for me is the line that says that part of the role is improving public awareness of the welfare issues that serving families and personnel face. Which I would wholeheartedly support. My only slight qualm about that is it works two ways. So that having a role that coalesces that understanding and helps us amplify people's voices could be really, really powerful. I'd like to put on the record that I think it would be really helpful if it's done in a way which supports the role in general rather than would put people off joining our military. Part of the challenge the military has at the moment is the impact of gapping and the poor retention. This needs to be a part of bolstering the offer, talking about some of the benefits and challenges of military life, because otherwise we run the risk of making life worse for people because retention falls even lower. So I recognise that's straying into a different area, but I wouldn't want an opportunity to become a threat. Thank you.
Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming to provide us with evidence today. As Devonport's MP, I get lots of copies of Homeport from the Naval Families Federation from my constituency office, so thank you for all those that come through the post. For me, it's the extension to families, which is one of the key parts of this legislation, because it's the first real time that we've had the acknowledgement of families in the Armed Forces Act with a real focus on their welfare needs. I'm really interested to get your perspective as to how you think a Armed Forces Commissioner's Office would deal with and seek to build trust with the families, because it is much easier for the Commissioner to visit a base. And if there's accommodation on site, that might be the case, but we know that not everyone who serves in their families lives on bases, and we explicitly exclude the Commissioner from having a right to inspect without someone's notice their home for very good and obvious reasons. But how do you think the Commissioner should be accessing and seeking to get views from and being responsive to the needs of families? Because I know that will change depending on service, depending on location, and the barriers to get there. I think it's important that we have an understanding about what they are so we can seek to overcome them. We'd be grateful if you could expand on that kind of challenge. Should we go for the Navy first? Naval?
That's okay. That will be the tricky bit, absolutely. Building the trust, giving prompt responses, actually doing what the Commissioner says he's going to do, he or she, will be really important to build that trust. We know from the Covenant, for example, that's been around for 12 years, if you ask serving personnel and their families, the large percent of them don't even know still what the Covenant is, what it does, how it changes their lives. And that's been around for a long time. So that's just an example of education is absolutely key, and building trust and rapport, and having some really slick processes so that if somebody has been invited to ask a question, they get a swift response in plain language. And again, that's going to be really important, that when you respond to a serving personnel, you might send them a link to JSP, whatever, that won't wash. Absolutely, with families who probably can't access said JSP because it's behind the firewall, and also, what good is that? So having those really tailored responses and being mindful again of the audience that will be new will be absolutely key, and that's going to be the tricky bit.
Thank you.
I would echo Sarah's comments. This is something that we've grappled with and Defence have grappled with for a long time, is how you engage with families. I think it's really important to understand how important, as Sarah says, trust in the system is. So if expectations are not met and are not met fairly swiftly, families on past experience will simply not engage. But there is a more practical element. Sarah touched on it: accessibility, understandability. Too many of the responses that come out of Defence, too much of the communication that comes out of Defence, is in language that is simply not accessible to people who are not wearing uniform. I would argue, as somebody who used to wear uniform and was an MOD civil servant, not accessible to me even at times. So making that clear, making it really, really easy to access, offering a range of access. Yes, we are all shifting to digital. Yes, we have seen within our organisations a distinct switch to people wanting to engage with us via email or other digital means, but there is still a large section of families who actually are not really able or not willing to engage in that process, and will need to be able to pick up the phone and speak to somebody. And have somebody at the other end who understands what they are saying. Because we have seen, if I may refer back to the housing issue and the rollout of the new housing contract and the Pinnacle help desk, one of the biggest issues with that was actually not having somebody who picked up the phone, and when they did, they had no understanding and no empathy and sympathy with the issues that were being raised, let alone understanding of them. So in terms of the actual physical process of access, that will be absolutely key in making sure that that works for families and is consistent and delivers what they expect.
Okay.
The only thing I would add to that is that there is an opportunity to get it right at the beginning. Yes, no one gets everything nailed on first time. The person in that role needs to develop it. But if the offer is very clear at the beginning, that makes it a lot easier. And by that I mean, is this, and this is part of the process that we're working out now, is this office more strategic or tactical? And by that I mean, if people are making a series of phone calls to that office, that is going to have to be staffed to deal with multiple thousands of calls a year. If that's not what the office is going to be set up to do, and it's more about dealing and amplifying strategic messaging about what's going wrong, then the communications can be based on that. But if families are led to believe this is somewhere I can ring and they're going to get my house sorted, it's managing those expectations, nailing those comms, and therefore upstream of that, being very clear and coherent about what the office is setting out to do. Is it individual case management for any family who rings them up with a problem? That's very different to an office that is viewing the evidence and going, actually the key issues for military families are those three, and here is what my team are going to do about it. So in terms of what you then communicate to families, those are quite different beasts, and really important to get right.
Thanks, Chair. Pam Cox.
This afternoon, one of the key functions of the new Commissioner will be to promote the welfare of persons subject to service law, and key phrase, relevant family members. That's left deliberately broad. I'd like to know your view of how a relevant family member might be defined.
I'll give it a shot. Where to start? I think it's the problem that we've been grappling with for many years. As the Army Families Federation is 40 years old, actually it's 42 years old, sorry. And what a family member looked like back then is very, very different to what a family member looks like now. And maintaining that flexibility about what a family member is has been absolutely key for us in being able to properly support families. It may very well be a spouse or a civil partner. It may be children. It may be grandparents if they're involved in caring or supporting for the family in any way. It may be aunts and uncles. It may, quite frankly, with many of the people we deal with, some of whom have had quite challenging and difficult upbringings, they regard their wider friendship network as their family and their support network. So it's a real challenge sometimes for us as an organisation to delineate and to work out in order that we can best support the individual or the family in question. Clearly, when it comes to provision of defence processes and services, there are quite clear rules and regulations about who is in scope and who is out of scope. I personally, my organisation might take issue with some of those, but nonetheless they are quite clearly laid out. And one of the key difficulties that families face is often navigating that alongside their expectations and alongside actually how wider society and some of the statutory external bodies I referenced earlier regard a family. So it is the level of confusion. I think this process will have to work through quite quickly, referencing back to Maria's point about expectation management. I note in the debate and the questions there were in the House that there were quite a lot of comments about bereaved families. I mean, we would certainly, I think, wish to see, there's been a significant amount of work in identifying and supporting bereaved families in terms of their actual rather than perceived needs over the last couple of years. And we, I think, would certainly like to see bereaved families addressed in some way within the scope of the Armed Forces Commissioner's activities. But again, that would probably be something of a challenge because the needs and requirements of a bereaved family, when initially bereaved, can be quite different to a family potentially 10, 20 years down the line. And that would most definitely be something of a challenge for the Armed Forces Commissioner themselves to work through. But we do feel quite strongly that bereaved families should be included in the scope of the definition of families. Beyond that, it is not straightforward. We would like to see the broadest possible because that is what service personnel and their families need. And it should be responsive to their needs, not responsive to what happens to be in the relevant JSB.
If I could just just add to that, I recognise that in terms of dealing with legislation, there may need to be, for example, and I don't know because I'm not responsible for legislating this bill, but there may need to be a clause around what is applicable overseas and in the UK in terms of the families and how they're defined and dealt with. But if I can use a live example of why it's important to keep it as broad as possible, adult children who are no longer defined at the moment as dependents, in inverted commas, but we have lots and lots of families talking to us about the needs of their young adult children who at the moment can't access bases because they no longer get a dependence pass because perhaps they're at university or they've left. But of course, for the families these days, it's really hard for a young person to get accommodation. So often they're still staying at home, sharing married quarters in a way which they wouldn't have been doing 10, 20 years ago. So it's that sort of thing in the changing shape of family, which is an opportunity for this bill to allow some of those issues to be voiced and relevant to an Armed Forces Commissioner.
If I could just add, a family may also constitute a couple that have chosen not to have children or who can't have children. So we may think of them as a couple. Actually, they're a family because they're a couple. And that's, are they within or without scope? So again, just considering every single differing family dynamic is so important so that people aren't excluded. Sorry.
How do you envisage this bill improving service life? And you mentioned the communications and the importance of the communication and getting the information to service personnel. How do you see your role within that?
So I think when I was thinking about that element prior to this, I think it very much depends on perhaps how this pans out in terms of how strategic or how tactical the role of the Commissioner officers. We very much want this to be a really, really helpful change in how military families and personnel are supported. And so therefore we want as useful working relationship with the Armed Forces Commissioner as possible. We would certainly, for example, be really keen to be sharing the information and evidence that we get all year with the Commissioner on a regular basis. And I think there is a rich pattern of data across the sector, the third sector, that deal with families that could be brought to bear in terms of informing exactly where those big issues are that the Armed Forces Commissioner could be shining a light on, perhaps leaning in with government departments. And I think the change in this particular legislation is that report to Parliament. Now, the Armed Forces Covenant also legislates for a report for Parliament every year. That is not necessarily independent. It's government reporting on itself. This gives a layer of independence. And if we can use that mechanism and get behind it to help the Commissioner have the evidence they need to enact change, that's certainly how we see our role and working with the Commissioner's office going forward.
Thank you. Just to add to that, I think the importance of evidence is absolutely key. If we were to go for a scattergun approach and ask several charities, they would have an opinion. However, is that helpful? Whereas the Families Federations work very hard to provide evidence so that we can find the themes, we can find out what matters most. Not to say that we discount other things that may be in the margin, but I think it's so important to have some evidence base on which to make decisions. Otherwise, we could just go for scattergun and tie ourselves up in knots and jump on things that perhaps are important to some, but are they as important for others? So, a certain amount of prioritisation. And that's exactly what we've been doing for a number of years. And the opportunity to build on that and funnel some of this information upwards for decision making is most welcome.
Just to build on my colleagues' comments, I think many, not all, but many of the issues that face service personnel and their families and impact positively or negatively on their decision to join the armed forces, stay in the armed forces, are fairly well known and have been looked at in the past from a number of different angles. And as Sarah says and Maria says, there is a rich level of evidence already in place. Using that, but really trying to understand the scale and the depth of the issues. The issues are all well known, and people have their own. There are many of us who will get behind a certain one at a certain time, or there will be an external event that prompts examination. But really understanding across that broad range which are the ones that are really impacting, rather than it's an irritation and but what's making a real difference? What's the depth and the scale, and getting it behind those issues, I think, is something that the Armed Forces Commissioner could bring real value to. Galvanising all of the various bodies across, externally and across defence and across government, to coordinate, cooperate in order to do that, I think could be really quite a significant and positive change.
Okay, David Reid.
Thanks, Chair. Just a question to Sarah, please. You mentioned the continuity of education allowance, CEA. This is a hot topic, and the rates have just been released, and it's clear that the rates are not going to be enough to be able to allow service personnel to keep their kids in certain schools. Is there a fear that with this transition from Ombudsman to Commissioner, that issues like this might fall through the cracks in the interim? And what can be done, do you think, to make sure that their voices are heard as quickly as possible? Because this is going to be an issue that's going to play out in the coming months.
Thank you. Yeah, a really good question. So I think dealing with the frustration, as I mentioned, it's the inability to make an informed choice. If people are given the information that they need, they can decide which way to go. But not having that information, and therefore it coming late, people are feeling let down again. An erosion of the offer, not feeling looked after. And in the context of busy serving personnel who are not at home for long periods of time to do admin, and that's often left to the spouse who can't make the decisions because they also haven't got the information that they require. So again, it's all about feeling valued, feeling as though if it is part of the offer, then there's a slick process. Armed Forces personnel have been considered. They can get the information they need to look after and give their children the continuity of education that they deserve. So I think it's around the package of feeling valued and being mindful that people are very busy. I'm deployed on a ship, deployed on a submarine for the people that we're looking after. And of course, the Royal Marines, operational tempo is just constant. So there isn't that time, and if there is the time to be at home to do such things as admin, as CEA, whatever it may be, the processes need to be really slick. We've got instances of people coming to us and saying, this is just too tricky, it's too difficult, I've tried this, I've tried to speak to that person, and in the end it's too difficult. And do you know what, I'm going to leave because I've had enough, it's too difficult. And that's where we'll come in and say, surely you must be able to speak to a human being who understands your frustration, who can get this over the line so that you can go and deploy without being distracted. And a lot of the time it falls back to the charity sector to help in those ways. Is that right? Don't know, but it's becoming more prevalent that the charities will pick things up just to take away a little bit of the pain. It really shouldn't be that painful. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but slick processes and information and feeling valued is key.
Thank you, Sarah. And just open that question up to Maria and Claire. Is there any other points that you'd like to add?
I think I would. I don't believe that I have a specific concern about the Ombudsman being rolled into the Armed Forces Commissioner, making things more complex or worse. Any machinery of government change can potentially add some time to a system. I get that. Although I think that it does feel like there's an opportunity to look at the complaint system itself and whether it's fully fit for purpose in that change. But I recognise that that's not what this bill is focused on. So I think that's my main concern, that the actual Ombudsman processes are as effective as they can be when they're moved over, and therefore that in itself doesn't cause problems.
And I just echo my colleagues' comments. There's nothing substantive that I can add.
Are there any more questions? If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank our witnesses for coming and giving our evidence this afternoon. Thank you very much. I think the star of the show is now going to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Come on down. So, Minister, if you'd like to give us your name, rank and serial number, we'll get on.
Hello, my name is Luke Pollard. I'm the Minister for the Armed Forces.
Okay. Mr Francois.
Thanks very much. Francois. Lieutenant 523962. Very, very rusty number. Minister, we'll get into all of the debates on Thursday, but I think could we give you fair notice that after the testimony of a number of people today, including from the last panel, we're probably going to try and provoke a debate on special needs education under Clause 3 when we get to that, just to give you and your officials time to prepare. A couple of other questions, though, on the bill more broadly. Something you said at second reading which wasn't entirely clear, I don't mean that critically, but it's just the way that it came out. Is the Commissioner still going to take up individual cases which have exhausted the service complaints process, or in the way that the Service Complaints Ombudsman currently does, or is the Commissioner only going to concentrate generally on more thematic issues? Because if it's the latter and not the former, that's a very big change. So could you perhaps clarify that?
Yeah, certainly. When it comes to just the point on SENS, we haven't specified an exhaustive list of what the Commissioner should be looking at, precisely because of the independence of the Commissioner allows them to choose which issues they want to address based on the feedback that they're receiving from Armed Forces personnel and their families, or they've identified on their visits. And so it's not an exhaustive list, very happy looking at particular circumstances, and thank you for the notice. When it comes to the role of the Commissioner, we're effectively rolling in the Service Complaints Ombudsman functions into the Commissioner. The additional own initiative powers that will be added to this role, forming the Commissioner's office, will be for them to undertake thematic inquiries. Now, again, we haven't overly specified the process that will happen when someone gets in touch with the Commissioner, precisely because we want the Commissioner to define what their processes should be, and so they have the independence to establish that the processes, the structures, the ability to listen, to feed into their thematic reports. And to the same extent, we haven't specified how many thematic reports a Commissioner should make. We're working on the assumption, effectively, if you look at a range of issues, that an annual report would contain a summary of their work throughout the year, as well as the usual annual reporting details about staff levels, volumes and other bits like that. But the bill also includes the power for the Commissioner to publish separate reports if they choose to, on a thematic issue. Now, that will be, again, down to the Commissioner to decide about where that comes from, but also where the issues are taken up. And so the ability for the Commissioner to look at the service complaints system and the issues that are coming through that as one of the measures that they will be able to make a decision on about what thematic areas to investigate, what recommendations to make to government via Parliament, will be up for the Commissioner to decide.
So just to be really clear, it's both. So the Commissioner, if Corporal Atkins has exhausted the service complaints process but still feels deeply aggrieved and is convinced that the service complaints process hasn't adequately dealt with their issue, they could still go to the Commissioner, and the Commissioner could decide, they'd have discretion, just as the Ombudsman always had, whether or not to take up Corporal Atkins' complaint and then look into it in more detail. Yes?
Exactly right. So all the SCOAF functions move entirety. So the only change we're making on SCOAF functions is one very slightly minor change, which at the moment you need an officer to decide the validity or eligibility, and it's moving to an official. Apart from that, the entire SCOAF system is unchanged deliberately because the place for any revisions to the functioning of the service complaint system would be via the Armed Forces Bill, which will come in about 2 years' time or so, if there are to be any amendments there. But it gives the Commissioner the ability to be informed by the service complaint system, as well as anything else that they may receive, as to what thematic investigations or areas they want to look at.
Pretty clear, thank you. I'll stop there because I know you've only got limited time for your panel, and there'll be others that want to ask you questions. So thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, Michelle Scrope.
It's all very quiet on the National Veterans Commissioner. all the devolved governments have them? When will we be getting that here?
Thank you. So the Minister for Veterans and People has been looking at the system at the moment and is going to be taking steps to see what is the most appropriate representation or system to be put in place, because we inherited a system that has them in some locations but not in all, and so our Council will be looking at that in due course. When it comes to the interaction between any established Commissioner for Veterans or any veterans group and the Commissioner, we've deliberately not specified that in the bill, again for the reasons that we want the Armed Forces Commissioner to make an independent judgment. However, my expectation on that would be that there'd be regular meetings between the Commissioner and the variety of stakeholder groups that operate in the wider Armed Forces community, partly to check in on issues, but also importantly to check in on progress of their recommendations and how they're being implemented, because a key part of this is shining a spotlight on an issue, and it's not sufficient in my mind to say, here's an issue, presented to Parliament. There needs to be an understanding about what happens next with it, and that's where that interaction would probably be most found.
Okay, and can I ask, the Commissioner can access unannounced any of the sites within the UK, but the Secretary of State has the power to restrict access. How will that actually work in practice?
I think in practice, what we will be establishing when the Commissioner's office is stood up, there'll be a ways of working agreement between the Commissioner and the single services about how things work. I'm not expecting the Armed Forces Commissioner to be using their unannounced powers very frequently. If you look at the German model, the Armed Forces Commissioner in Germany spends about a third of her year undertaking visits, of which nearly all of them are planned visits. It's the ability to have an unannounced visit in your toolbox that makes those powers even more prominent, because there's the opportunity that if an issue is reaching a certain threshold, that they can take a decision to make an unannounced visit. I think where it comes to the particular powers we've included in the bill about national security, that comes from the importance of making sure that in the proper exercising of their duties, they're focusing on general service welfare matters. Because what we don't want to see the Commissioner doing, and I think you heard this from when the current SCOAF presented earlier, is looking at the secret squirrel elements. I don't want them looking into the intelligence services or secret squirrel locations, the operational design of missions, for instance. That all sits outside their remit, and their remit is solely focused on national, not on national security, but on general service welfare. So the ability to define that via secondary legislation is a prudent and proportionate power that we have in the bill. I suspect what will actually happen in most cases is once the secondary legislation has been published that details that, there'll just be a ways of working approach established. And I can't really imagine any Armed Forces Commissioner having a remit and having operations that step outside a very, very clearly defined general service welfare lane. But if there are concerns, their power is also put in the bill for the Secretary of State to exercise that caution on visits. And that would especially be true if there were a national security consideration, which we wouldn't really expect to be there, given the welfare focus. But it's a proportionate safeguard and power just in case.
Thank you.
Okay, Lincoln Job.
Particularly obliged to Maria Lyle for highlighting this issue over is it going to be a call centre and is it going to be thematic big reports? Because the explanatory note for the bill says the bill will establish an independent commissioner to serve as a direct point of contact for armed forces personnel and their families. And yet I've read the bill and it doesn't do that in my view. What it does do is it takes on the Ombudsman's powers, that's chunk one, but that's only service complaints. And if you've got a housing problem, it's rarely going to be subject to a service complaint. It's going to go up the housing route. And then secondly, it's the more general thematic investigations. So at the moment, I think that the bill as presented does two things. I don't think it acts as the sort of day-to-day, this is where you go when you've got a problem, because then you're into jurisdictions of local authorities, local education authorities. It's a series of routes. If you're telling us that we're going to change the service complaints procedure so that...
Sitting's now suspended. We shall resume. I'll resume the chair in 15 minutes. Mr. Jupp, Mr. Jupp. Hello. You were in the middle of a question.
I was. Well, there was a question mark. I promise at the end of it. The point that I was making was that the bill and the explanatory note don't match, in as much as the explanatory note suggests three functions, i.e. taking on the existing Ombudsman's roles, secondly, to act as a point of contact for all armed forces families, and thirdly, the wider thematic piece. But when I look at the draft bill as it currently is, I see two of those, namely the Ombudsman's duties and also those of the thematic. And so I certainly think that, whilst loosely drawn, I think that's going to leave a lot to subsequent interpretation in order not to mismanage expectations. Would you, having listened to the evidence today, do you agree?
Thank you for that point. I don't think it's necessary to legislate for the ability for the Commissioner to have an email address, a website or a postal address. We've given a commitment at second reading debate that the Commissioner should be able to be accessible on a range of means. I think it is up to the Commissioner to be able to determine what those range of means are and then to be able to flex their resourcing to deliver that. But the intent behind the establishment of those three functions as you described them will be to provide a way of people who are serving and their families to contact the Commissioner. It might be for the Commissioner to decide that on thematic investigations they operate a consultation function or direct stakeholder function in addition to some of the means for direct contact. But that's not necessary in primary legislation, which is the reason why it's not in primary legislation. But it is the reason why it's in the explanatory notes to explain the different roles that the Commissioner will have.
My other question was, we heard three witnesses today, two of whom said that they identified the risk of the legislation eroding the authority of the military chain of command, one of whom said that he had had a good session with you and had come away convinced that it would not do so. Would you like to enlighten us as to how you managed to convince the General, whereas the more junior officers were more sceptical?
Well, I think the important thing about it is to look at the outcome and the focus, because the Commissioner's job is not to countermand orders or instructions given by the chain of command. That's not within their remit. They would not be able to undertake that activity. Where there will be support for the chain of command is delivering a better output for their people. And what we've seen certainly in recent years, and the situation that the new government's inherited, is that we have a situation where we have falling morale falling in all our services, every year for the last 10 years. We know that for every 100 people that join the armed forces, 130 leave at the moment, and that's not good enough. That's why when we talk about renewing the contract between the nation and those who serve, and the Armed Forces Commissioner being the first legislative pillar of doing that, the largest pay rises for 20 years, increasing recruits' pay by 35% are a part of that fellow travellers in that journey. What we're trying to do is support people who to join the armed forces and to stay in it longer. We're aware that for some of the chain of command, the issues that their people are raising with them are not within their remits. So we have, for instance, over many years, certainly the last decade or so, we've contractualised housing out of the responsibility of a base commander, for instance. And so the ability for commanding officers to be able to respond to some of the welfare needs of their people has been diminished by changes in contractualisation, changes in operating procedures. Now, we're hoping to make some inroads into looking at what we can do to support that by trusting our people more. And as part of that, what we want to do is to have a commissioner that can shine a spotlight on where there are thematic issues, but effectively issues that are affecting our people and their families. And so I don't see this as in any way challenging the chain of command. What I see it as is the ability for the chain of command to deliver their functions in a more efficient manner by having a greater focus on the welfare needs of their people, which is a complementary function to the many welfare needs that are undertaken by the chain of command already, but especially for those areas where they might not have any levers. And that is why we're suggesting the Commissioner should report to Parliament via a necessary sifting of national security, scrubbing of reports by the MOD, so that we can shine a spotlight on that, because I think, having spoken to many people, both in opposition and in government, who are in the chain of command, I think they have an absolute focus on improving the welfare of their people. They don't always have the ability to improve all aspects of it. And that is why we hope the Commissioner will assist. It's not the only area, but it is an important area of making sure that parliamentarians of all parties can scrutinise where there is a deficiency in the welfare provision for our people and their families, and that's what we hope to do with this Commissioner.
We might return to this on Thursday, but Chair, thank you very much indeed.
Graham Down.
Very much. Just actually to pick up something you just said there, Minister, about making sure that issues are actually handled and dealt with, and you mentioned it before, making sure issues previously had fallen away and not been taken up by the MOD. Would that not make it more sensible to have a duty on the face of the bill for the MOD to respond to Commissioner reports to make sure action can be taken? I just wonder if you could comment a little bit on that.
So it's quite normal for legislation of this type for there not to be a provision in primary legislation. It's certainly the intent of the Secretary of State and myself to make sure there is provision given to that coming back, but aware of an amendment that's been tabled by the Liberal Democrats in a similar way. I'm happy taking that issue and having a discussion about what we can do to make sure that that there's sufficient attention put on any recommendations, because it's certainly, when we're drafting the legislation, what we've been trying to do is to make sure that where a Secretary of State who hasn't been involved with the origin of the Armed Forces Commissioner may be in post, there's no obstacles that they can put in place to the proper scrutiny of the welfare needs of Armed Forces personnel and their people. And so the expectation is that, of course, the Ministry of Defence would respond to those recommendations. And what we would need to establish informally, which doesn't require primary legislation, is the methods for tracking the recommendations. Certainly, as a new government, we're very aware that many of the recommendations made by the Defence Select Committee, for instance, to government over the past decade have not been sometimes even responded to, information provided to. And as part of renewing the relationship between Parliament and the Ministry of Defence, to enhance parliamentary scrutiny of what the Ministry of Defence does, which we believe will produce better outcomes, both strategically and for our people, that will be able to respond to those recommendations from the Armed Forces Commissioner, HCDC, and other bodies that report on the welfare needs of our people.
And just, I guess, on the other side of that, if someone is dissatisfied with the outcome they've received from the Commissioner, is there a way they can appeal that? And I covered this earlier on with other witnesses where I expressed a concern about if someone is materially affected being in the hands of the Commissioner. So what if there's a situation where someone does not feel that their case has been taken up or that their issue has not been raised? Is there any kind of redress for them to go beyond and determine why that's the case or to complain in any way?
Yeah, so the legislation has been drawn, so the decisions of what issues to take up, which priority effectively to look at, and which sequence an issue will be looked at, certainly on the thematic side, that's a decision for the Commissioner to be informed by. Certainly, for a Commissioner of this type, the complaints, the challenge procedure would be via judicial review, which would be similar for other commissioners of this style if there was a serious challenge to that. But what we're not trying to do is set an expectation that the Commissioner will be able to undertake a thematic investigation immediately into every major topic. So what we've seen from the German model is that the annual report may contain a large number of items or areas where they've received a form of representation. The German model calls it a petition, which doesn't quite work in the English translation of it, but where someone's written to the Commissioner to raise a concern about something, that's then used as a way of inputting feedback for then the Commissioner to make a decision on what to analyse. So clearly, given the breadth of issues that fall under a general service welfare matter, which is quite considerable, there's quite a lot that could be in there. And I'm grateful for colleagues, raising particular concerns, housing, SEND. There's a lot that could be featured part of there. We've drawn the legislation purposely that decision is made by the Commissioner. It's not made by government ministers directing as to where it goes, where it should be. But that's for the Commissioner to establish those procedures, which I would expect the first Commissioner to do so.
And just finally, the relationship with the devolved administrations, I raised this at second reading, where there's areas such as health which are devolved. How do you envisage the Commissioner working with devolved administrations, both in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, but also across England as well?
So defence is a reserved matter, so it's appropriate that this legislation legislates for all of the United Kingdom, but we are aware that some of the welfare matters are devolved in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and indeed across the overseas territories, which are, with the exception of Gibraltar, that have a different legislative setup than the other OTs, might be responsibility of a non-Westminster administration. in those circumstances, what we've chosen to do is not to require those devolved administrations to report or to respond in the same way as we do for the Ministry of Defence to be able to lay the report. But we're using the same kind of principles that SSAFA, who spoke earlier, has, which is effectively an agreement that there will be a conversation with the devolved administrations on those matters. I'm expecting a constructive relationship, as similar roles have with devolved administrations, but we haven't specified a requirement for them to report back or to respond to the Commissioner's report. What we are aware is, for instance, issues around service housing, around RF Lossiemouth, for instance. That would be a responsibility of the local council in Scotland as well as the Scottish Government. And so in those circumstances, if the Commissioner were looking at housing in a Scottish context, you would expect there to be recommendations that they may make to the Scottish Government. I would expect them to have a dialogue with the Scottish Government to be able to deliver an understanding. But the legislation grips on the Westminster Government because defence is a reserved matter in that respect.
Cheers, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
David Reid.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, it's clear from the second reading of the bill that there is broad cross-party support for this piece of legislation. But it'd be really good to hear from your perspective how this bill came to be, how it's been brought to Parliament so quickly, and who the dominant voices were in sort of forming the nuance of this bill. I think we heard from the current service complaint ombudsman that the demand signal didn't come from their office, although it was one of the points on their sort of wish list. It wasn't one of the main points. So it'd be interesting to hear from you how this came to be. And then secondly, just while I have you, the point that was raised around the single service charities having a clear route to lodge complaints, if needs be, against the new commissioner. It would be good to see if there's support for that, if we can add that into the bill in the coming days.
Thank you. I mean, while in opposition, we were looking at what were those areas that our people in the armed forces and their families were experiencing difficulties. It fed to the broad concern of why are so many people leaving our armed forces, why is there a challenge on recruitment, and why is morale falling and has been falling for the last decade. And although there's not one single reason for that, in many cases it's an aggregation of lots of different reasons. There's a general sense from the Secretary of State, myself and other members of the then Shadow Defence team, that there was a problem with the offer, with effectively the contract between the nation and those who served, and actually having the ability to have an independent person being able to articulate and advocate those issues to government would be beneficial. And certainly that reflects, I think, a concern that in some cases the issues that we've heard from the evidence given today, they're quite well known. And so the ability to shine a spotlight more clearly on those issues to prompt action was something that we were quite keen on. We've worked quite closely in opposition and with the officials in the Ministry of Defence subsequently to forming a government with the German Armed Forces Commissioner's office. Dr. Eva Hogel has been exceptionally helpful in terms of providing not just the kind of like advice on legislative underpinnings. She described her version of this bill as perfect, so it's quite a high bar for us to hit in terms of how we scrutinise this, but in terms of the implementation of how it works. And I think that has given us an idea about how can we make sure that when we're looking at a service welfare matter, that there is adequate scrutiny and that by having those reports effectively given ultimately to Parliament, that we are avoiding the situation that can sometimes happen in this place where reports are given to government and then sat on. And that's what we're hoping to avoid here by routing it effectively via the Ministry of Defence for a national security scrub, which I think everyone in this room would expect, and then being laid by the Secretary of State within a defined time period to Parliament to look at. So I'm pretty confident about that. But we also looked at the SSAFA reports from past that effectively asked for the own initiative powers. I think it's quite hard for an independent role like SSAFA, albeit within the government orbit, to engage directly with opposition in that respect. But I've been grateful for Mariette's engagement since this, looking at where the bill can reflect the objectives that she may have in terms of own initiative powers and how that would work. So that's how effectively the origin of how we got to where we are here. We wanted this bill to be one of the first pieces of legislation that the new government proposed to Parliament. because we wanted it to be a signpost and a signal, a statement of intent to our people, those people who serve, that actually we recognise that there's been an erosion of the contract between the nation and themselves, and we want to do something about it. It will take some time to mobilise this office, assuming a standard journey through parliamentary scrutiny. We're hoping that the Armed Forces Commissioner's Office will be stood up at the start of 2026, which gives some time for procedures and policies to be put in place, a decent appointment process, which includes a proper opportunity for the House of Commons Defence Select Committee to scrutinise anyone who may be selected at the end of that. In relation to your second area, I'm happy having a chat with you about how complaints would be made. When we held stakeholders events with service charities and veterans organisations prior to or just immediately after, around the point of first reading, when the bill is published for the first time, there's a question about whether there should be a super complaint function, i.e. charities being able to raise an issue. And if so, in legislation you normally have to define who is able to do that. And what we didn't want to do is create an insider group of charities and an outsider group of charities, where some would be able to do so and others wouldn't do. Didn't feel like the right idea here, but what we would expect is for the Commissioner to have regular dialogue, structured, formal, informal, however they may see fit, with the wider armed forces community, to listen to their concerns, to make sure it works. And I think the first Commissioner will be establishing those processes and procedures. That's up to them to define what those are, including complaints procedures and the other normal running of an office like this. We haven't specified that in legislation, partly because it's unnecessary to do so in primary legislation, but also because they're effectively the minimum requirements for a proper functioning office that would be set up. Very similar to how SCOAF works now, very similar to the Information Commissioner, Children's Commissioner and other similar type of roles across government.
It's time, so just slightly briefer answers would be welcome. Thank you very much. Pam Cox.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. You may know I've got an unusual and slightly possibly unhealthy interest in comparing the powers of commissioners and ombudsman from a previous life. I do wonder why we are creating a new commissioner when we might have upped the powers of the existing ombudsman. So perhaps you'd like to elaborate on that one.
You could argue that we're doing both,
yeah,
actually. And so the SCOAF function has wanted own initiative powers for quite some time, but there was a sense that actually simply just giving additional powers to the Service Complaints Ombudsman, that is a system that scrutinises a formalised and legislated for complaints system, wasn't quite the way to exercise the own initiative powers, the thematic investigations. That's why we've created a new office, effectively rolling in the SCOAF, but being very clear that there is a change here that improves the scrutiny function, that provides not only an expansion, massive expansion of the opportunities for service personnel and for the first time their families to access that type of opportunity. And as a result, it needed to be named accordingly to demonstrate that change. So I think actually we have delivered, in theory, a better SCOAF as part of this function, but also a broader Armed Forces Commissioner opportunity. We haven't amended the SCOAF legislation at this stage. And as I mentioned earlier, there will be an opportunity to do so if there are amendments that are required in the Armed Forces Bill that will follow. This effectively sets the broad parameter that says there should be own initiative powers, there should be independent persons to advocate on behalf of service people. So that's why the legislation has been drawn as it is.
And just one brief follow-up, if I may, that I note your comments about refreshing the contract between the nation and those who serve. Given that, why have you not included a duty for the MOD to respond to the Commissioner's reports?
So I picked that up just answer to the question from the colleague from Dunfermline and Dollar. I'm very happy having a look at what that could be like. It's not normal that this is in every piece of legislation that would respond to that. The normal process within government would be that there would be a response to these, but I'm happy, including the Honourable Lady, in the conversations that I'm happy having to try and work out whether that is a requirement to add to primary legislation, or whether a commitment to respond, as would normally be the case, would be sufficient to address those concerns. But happy having a conversation.
Thank you.
Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Minister. So we'd all like to see a strong and independent commission, a real champion for the armed forces, and I wonder what certainty we can gain that the Secretary of State powers are set out in the bill are not going to undermine the Commissioner's independence.
Well, we've deliberately drawn the powers to be quite limited for the Secretary of State to effectively only be able to restrict access, as an example, on national security grounds, or where there would be a danger to a person. So effectively the example that might work there is visiting the front line during combat operations. There's clearly a danger to our people if there were to be a formal visit, and there's probably a danger to the Commissioner in that situation. So that gives a prudent safeguard power. But what we've deliberately tried to do is separate the Secretary of State's powers that might normally exist from a role like this, to separate them so there's more independence for the Commissioner themselves. What we've also done by establishing a novel route to Parliament is provided Parliament with greater ability to raise any concerns, or for the Commissioner, if they encounter any difficulties with interactions with the Ministry of Defence, or other providers of services for our people, to be able to raise that in their reports, which is then given to a Parliament to be able to independently scrutinise, separate from the MOD. So what we've tried to do is separate those functions out. I think we've succeeded in the bill, but the style of how that will happen in practice will depend on the person appointed to the office and how that office is established. But the principle of impartiality and independence from the Ministry of Defence, and importantly the single services as well, is at the heart of this piece of legislation, which is designed to build trust so people can go to the Commissioner if they want to raise a concern.
Thank you. And we'd all like to see the bill to be accessible to all service personnel. So how can the Secretary of State ensure that it will be accessible to everyone, including some reservists, female, the LGBTQ plus community, non-UK, black and minority and ethnic personnel?
The honourable lady is a relatively new member in this House. If she had been here over the last 7 years, she would have seen this massive guy over here speaking loudly about equality matters. I feel incredibly strongly about this. Yeah. And from an armed forces point of view, we should value all our people. All our people. And that is the intent of this bill, to effectively provide an opportunity for all our service people and their families, a cohort of people that are absolutely essential for the delivery of our national security, but for whom are often forgotten about in the legislative approaches and some of the approaches of the MOD in the past, to make sure that's included. There is already a public sector equality duty that exists with the Equality Act that would apply to the Commissioner. And so when the Commissioner would be undertaking their reports, they'd already be bound by that duty to investigate or to have a due regard to the different minority groups that form the armed forces and families. So I would expect that to be present. And if you're looking at some of the equivalent reports that we've seen, the experience not only of the whole armed forces but groups within it, however that may be defined, that would be an opportunity for the Commissioner to make that distinction, not just in determining what issue to raise, but also how they investigate it. So I would expect that to be front and centre. And if it's not included, I would expect Parliament to be able to scrutinise and ask questions of the Commissioner in due course there as well.
Thank you. One final one, if I may. The chain of command has been raised quite a few times by different individuals and people questioning, and I just wonder how you see the Commissioner will actually interact with the chain of command in practice to ensure that it's successful.
I would expect them to have regular meetings with the chain of command, senior officers, base commanders, people that form the rank and file of all our services. I think it's important that the Commissioner has the ability to decide who to interact with, and the ability to not only have interactions, but also, as set out in legislation, request information from the Ministry of Defence. So it's not just the ability to hold conversations, dialogue and engagement, but to actually get the information that's required to inform their recommendations.
Thank you,
Amanda Martin. Thank you.
We've heard about the erosion of the contract, and we've also heard that the same issues are raised time and time again. On top of that, the MOD have already produced several independent, although they are non-binding, reports to Parliament. Haythorne, Wake, Kerrs, Lake Sheldon, Atherton. What makes this different? How and why will this make a difference?
Well, I think across all those reports, with the exception of the Atherton review, which was a House of Commons Defence Select Committee report, a very good one as well, I think there is most of those have been externally commissioned, and often commissioned by the government, to report on an issue that they have chosen. The point of the Commissioner is that it wouldn't be informed by ministerial priorities of looking at what are the areas that the government of the day wants to look at. It would be informed by the representation that they receive from armed forces personnel and their families. And I think that's a really important distinction about that, because many cases reports have been commissioned, but not necessarily stuff done with it. And this provides a route for parliamentarians, therefore, to receive the report and to be able to raise questions and concerns. And I would expect the Commissioner to be a regular attendee with the House of Commons Defence Select Committee. It will be for that committee to determine how, when and in what format that engagement would take place. But I would expect there to be a brighter spotlight on those issues precisely to stop these reports and recommendations being effectively long-grasped as we might have seen over the last decade.
Thank you.
Terry Jervey.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Minister. In the very first witness comments, I was struck by the sort of observation that because the current Ombudsman role is funded by the government, there's a sort of acknowledgement that weakens the independence aspect. And of course, the new Commissioner will be funded by the government as well. Are you all sort of aware of that concern? And I appreciate Helen Maguire's comments around independence. Are you confident that there's sufficient safeguards around independence to encourage people to come forward?
I am, and the reason we've drafted the legislation in the way that we have is to be absolutely clear about a separation of this Commissioner's office from the Ministry of Defence. I think the point that Mariette was making in her evidence is the funding has to come from somewhere. However, I think it is how the Commissioner is appointed, how they operate, and how they build trust and confidence with our people that is the bit that builds the independence. Because we can legislate for independence and separation, as we have done, but I think it is in the operation of it that will build the trust with the people, and that's why I would expect the Commissioner to be on the road, to be visiting our forces, to be having those conversations, to build the trust, and I would expect them to have a robust scrutiny process in terms of their appointment, and I would expect them to be able to give ministers a tough ride on the delivery of the issues that matter. That's the reason we're doing this. If this role didn't have any teeth, there'd be no point legislating for it. I want this role to be able to carry a really bright spotlight to shine on the issues that are affecting our people. Because ultimately, if we do that, we recruit more people, we retain more people, and more people want to rejoin our armed forces, improving morale and service life, and that ultimately improves our operational effectiveness as a military.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Juliet Campbell.
A few of the witnesses today have spoken about relevant family member and the fact that it's not been defined in the face of the bill. I'm just wondering why you didn't, or it didn't define or adopt even the existing Armed Forces Covenant definition. It may have made it a little bit easier.
So this bill itself is not a standalone piece of legislation. It might be useful for members to understand that effectively it inserts legislation into the already existing Armed Forces Act, which includes a section, I think it's section 340, that includes the Armed Forces Covenant already. However, what we didn't want to do is specify in primary legislation the relevant family member for this one here, because we wanted it to be able to take more time to have conversations with stakeholders to define it via secondary legislation, so that could change if the definitions were to change in the future. And we have seen the fact that, you know, what is a family has changed. For me, a family is the most important unit of society, but how it is will be different for every different family. So trying to find the right definition, and that will be one that I'd imagine the Commissioner will have a view on after appointments, which they can then make recommendations of. That's why, effectively, there's an option of being able to revise that via secondary legislation, which is an easier process rather than undertaking primary legislation, which for Defence and the Armed Forces Bill only comes around once every 5 years.
Thank you.
Andrew Ranger, very briefly, we have till 10 past. Sorry, had you finished?
No, yes.
Sorry, go on, carry on.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. Officers Commissioners are a really important role, and they need to get to the information and the people that they need. So what enforcement mechanism will be available to them in case people don't cooperate?
So there's an obligation in the bill for the Secretary of State to cooperate with the Commissioner to provide information, and effectively when that is listed as the Secretary of State, that is the whole organisation under the Secretary of State has that obligation placed upon them. I would expect that they would be, upon appointment, the processes and functions would be established, just as they are with the current SCOAF function, in terms of being able to request information, who that goes to, how that should happen, what is the process and procedures to enable that to happen. If there is any obstacles or failure to deliver, which I think is what the think is what the Honourable Gentleman was getting at, that the provision in the bill allows the Commissioner to report that to Parliament to say there is a problem here, effectively in their annual report, and that would provide the parliamentary scrutiny which would be a deterrent from any Secretary of State in the future failing to provide the information that's necessary. Equally, we put a power in the bill for the Secretary of State to have to report to Parliament if they dismiss or remove the Armed Forces Commissioner, to enable that scrutiny function of Parliament as an oversight for the work of the Executive.
Okay, thank you. And one very, very quick one. How quickly do you expect... Yeah, how quickly do you expect to have the Commission up and running in post?
I expect the bill to complete early next year. I expect the appointment process to be roughly about an ish a year, and I expect the office to be stood up as a Commissioner's office at the start of 2026, taking cases and, importantly, ensuring that all SCOAF cases are smoothly transitioned without any detriment to the individuals in that process from the SCOAF function into the Armed Forces Commissioner function, to make sure there's no loss of any of that provision there.
Well, perfect timing. That concludes our session. Thank you very much. The committee will meet again at 11:30 a.m. on Thursday, the 12th of December, to commence line-by-line consideration of the bill. Look forward to seeing you all there.